Hey everyone, and welcome back to Be Like Christ. We are talking about Exodus chapter 22 in our 5-minute study today. When did the events of Exodus, Acts, I don't know which one we're talking about, Exodus 22 take place? Well, God delivered the Israelites from slavery in Egypt approximately 1491 BC, about 1500 years before Jesus. And the events of Exodus chapter 22 took place 3 months after the Hebrews left Egypt. We've really only got two main characters in this chapter. First, we have God. He has descended on Mount Sinai, and he's speaking with our second main character, who is Moses. And God is relaying his commands and his laws that he then wants Moses to take and communicate to his people, or the Israelite nation. Our map really hasn't changed very much from our last chapter. In Exodus chapter 22, we are centered in on Mount Sinai. God is having a conversation with Moses on top of the mountain. And so now thinking about our outline, the first 15 verses of Exodus 22 are the laws and the punishments for theft and for accidental damage. So as I mentioned, this chapter is really a continuation of God's conversation with Moses on Sinai, and God is communicating his laws and his rules, both the civic and religious laws that God wants the Hebrew people to live by going forward. The first law mentioned in this chapter, if a man stole an animal and he was caught, he was to pay anywhere between 2 to 5 times the original value of that animal to the man who he stole it from. If a man's animals were found to be grazing in another man's field, the owner of those animals had to pay back what was eaten with the best of his own vineyard or his own field. One thing that's interesting is that God assisted with bringing people to justice, or helping people who suspected other people of doing things wrong but maybe didn't have a whole lot of proof. God said that if a man suspected his neighbor of stealing from him, then he could bring his neighbor before God, and God would reveal whether or not the crime was committed. In another law, if a man was entrusted to care for his neighbor's animal, and a wild beast came along and killed that animal that was entrusted to him when it was in his possession, he did not have to make restitution for it because it was a wild animal that had killed it. However, if a man borrowed an animal from his neighbor and it died without the owner of the animal being present, then the man who borrowed it had to pay for it. But if the owner was present, then no restitution had to be made. And then finally, if a man rented an animal and that animal was injured or died during that rental period, the man who rented the animal didn't have to pay anything extra. He didn't have to pay restitution because that was part of the animal's hired price. So now that you know all about animal liability, let's move on to our second section in verses 16 through 31. Laws related to social justice and worship. So this is kind of a broad section. If a man slept with a virgin, he was required to marry that woman. If her father just absolutely refused to allow them to marry, then he still was required to pay the bride price for the woman. Sorcery, sexual relationships with animals, and idol worship were all punishable by death. And now that I said that, I'm probably going to have to demonetize this video because the Bible is not always YouTuber advertiser friendly, but we have to say it because it's in there. The Israelites were not to oppress foreigners who lived among them. Mistreating widows and orphans was also very strongly prohibited. A Hebrew was not to charge interest on money that he allowed another Hebrew to borrow. Also, if a man borrowed his neighbor's cloak, he was to have returned that cloak to him by the time that the sun set. Offerings to God were to be made promptly, and the firstborn of both men and animals were supposed to be dedicated to the Lord. And then finally, the Israelites were supposed to be a special people consecrated to the God who had saved them from Egyptian slavery. And now finally for our application. God has always cared for the less fortunate and for the poor. You notice verse 22 in this chapter includes one of the many commands in the Old Testament to care for widows and orphans and not to mistreat them. These commands are repeated in the New Testament. In the Epistle of James, he actually says that caring for widows and orphans is, quote, pure and undefiled religion. So my question for application is, What is your relationship with these kinds of less fortunate people? Does your religion lead into the service and into the company of these people? And if not, why not? Think about ways that you and I can be more involved in helping people who fall into these categories.